Thanks for joining us for a special presentation on the physical death of Jesus Christ, presented by medical professional Joseph Rosa.
There we go. So we're going to talk about a few things today. Historical dating, Roman history, Jewish class structure, and there's a laundry list of things up there, but we'll get to some of them in depth and some of them not so much. Okay, next slide, please. So just some bookkeeping data. BC means before Christ. AD means Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. BC comes after the date. AD comes before the date. And there is no year zero, which I found very interesting. I did not know that. Okay. So, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so some Roman history. Rome was founded in 753 BC. The Roman kingdom was founded by Romulus. Rome becomes a republic in 509 BC. Next slide. Julius Caesar. And this is the rise of the Roman Empire. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, so just quickly, the conquest of Gaul was 51 BC to 49 BC. Caesar returns to Rome in 49 BC. He refuses to give up his military command, as the Roman Senate demands. Caesar crosses the Rubicon from Gaul into Italy. So he famously says, "Aliecta est," which is Latin for "the die is cast." You may have heard that before, crossing the Rubicon. There's no coming back after crossing the Rubicon. So Caesar seizes control of the Senate, the government, in 49 BC, and he is murdered by the Roman Senate led by Marcus Brutus on the 15th of March, 44 BC. Okay, next slide. The Ides of March. Next slide. Okay, so the Civil War, there's a civil war that rages on for quite some time, from 27 BC when Octavian Caesar Augustus becomes the first emperor of Rome. Go ahead, next slide. And this is the Roman Empire. As you can see, it's in brown. It is massive. All the way from current day England, all the way down to current day Egypt, and then out into Turkey east, and then west, of course, to Spain. The news of Julius Caesar's death eventually reaches Judea and Nazareth, where Jacob, a direct descendant of Abraham and King David, was raising a son named Joseph. This is Jesus' future stepfather. This is King Herod the Great. All this will come together in a moment. I'm setting up the players that are involved in all this. So King Herod the Great was actually half Jewish and half Arab. He was appointed by Rome as king of Judea from 39 BC until his death in AD 4. King Herod learns of the birth of Jesus in approximately 6 BC. Now there are a lot of people going back and forth about what the dates were exactly. We don't know for sure. The people that spend their entire lives trying to figure out the dates of when Jesus was born and things of that sort. So approximately 6 BC, the Magi let Herod know about this. And then he embarks on a quest to kill Jesus and to protect his kingdom, because he knows, he's been told, this is the king of the Jews. So King Herod is aware of these prophecies that many have already come to fruition, and he's very concerned. And so something takes place called the Massacre of the Innocents in 4 BC. So this is an order given by Herod to kill all males under the age of 2 years old throughout the kingdom, in the vicinity of Bethlehem. Joseph sees this in a dream, and as you know, he escapes with Mary into Egypt. Now the question is, how long was he actually there? Some say years, some say months. It's not clear. The Gospel of Matthew really is the only place they mention this, Exodus to Egypt. Okay, next slide, please. Herod Antipas. He's one of the sons of the late King Herod. He takes control of Judea, which includes Galilee. Next slide. So here's a complicated slide. This essentially shows Israel at the time of Christ. Next slide. And here's a more detailed look at what Jerusalem looked like. It was a very compact area in the Holy Land. If you've ever been there, you'll see that it's quite easy to walk around in that area. Next slide. There's another example, and we'll get back to what this means. So this is about the time of Jesus, 30 AD, AD 30, I should say. Next slide. So Emperor Tiberius. After the death of Augustus Caesar in AD 14, Tiberius is the adopted son of Augustus. Next slide. And becomes the next Roman emperor from AD 14 to AD 37. He was a despicable individual. Where I'm getting with this is Tiberius appoints the fifth in a series of Judean governors, prefects, Pontius Pilate. Here he is. Now, Tiberius orders Pilate not to interfere, to meddle in the affairs of the Jews. And he makes that entirely clear. And you'll see in the future of this talk, when I continue, that this order will test Pilate and will influence what he does. Next slide. This is a picture I actually found from the movie Passion of the Christ. So Pilate forms a bond with Joseph Caiaphas. I can never say that right. He's a Sadducee, a powerful high priest. He has complete power over the Jews in Jerusalem. He cannot carry out a sentence of death, however. He needs the Romans to do such a thing, which is up to the governor, Pilate. So all the players are now in place. And this will now involve, or will demonstrate, two of the most profound events in the history of our world. Next slide. Okay. So Jesus' ministry begins in earnest with his baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. Jesus' spiritual journey lasts. Some will challenge some of the most powerful men of his time. From AD 26 to AD 30, Jesus teaches throughout Judea, chooses his 12 apostles, heals the sick, lame, deaf, raises many from the dead, casts out demons. Now, it's not clear exactly how long that ministry was. Some say 4 years, some say as short as 1 year. That is not clear. There are debates. That's what people get their PhDs in, figuring out all this information. So over this time period, Joseph Caiaphas, who will be the chief priest in AD 30, and that's important to remember, and other chief priests are trying to trap Jesus blaspheming, as you see in the Gospels all the time. They say, why does this man do this on these days, on the Sabbath? He heals on the Sabbath. So they're trying to trap him. And in their opinion, Jesus is a threat to the corrupt Jewish hierarchy and their way of life. He's an outsider coming in, trying to destabilize their way of life. So, in their opinion, the time has come to move against the Nazarene. Next slide. So now we'll get to the nuts and bolts of I just wanted to set things up for you to give you some sense of where we are and who all the players are. Bring you the history, and now we're ready to talk about things in more detail. So what is crucifixion and where did it originate? Excruciate describes something that causes great agony and torment. It comes from the Latin ex, meaning out of, and cruciate, meaning the cross. Thus the phrase, out of the cross. So crucifixion had been around quite some time. It began with the Assyrians and Babylonians, was systematically used by the Persians in the 6th century BC. Alexander brought it to Greece and Macedonia in the 4th BC. The Phoenicians introduced it to Carthage, and then eventually to Rome in the 3rd century BC. The Romans perfected crucifixion, not only as a means of execution, but a means of humiliation, degradation, as well as sending a powerful message displaying the might, power, and resolve of the Roman Empire. Next slide. And to give you a sense of that, during the Third Servile War from 73 BC to 71 BC, a slave uprising led by Spartacus, played by Kirk Douglas in the movie, you may have seen that, demonstrates this uprising that is put down by the Romans, demonstrates how brutal they really were and how they used crucifixion. They used it to intimidate and send messages. So this particular revolt was led by Marcus Lucius Crassus. 7,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way. 7,000. A 240-mile road between Rome and Naples. And they stopped just short because they ran out of people to crucify about 30 miles north of Naples in a town called Capua. And I believe they sent a message. There were no further uprisings. Give me the next slide. I'm not sure where I'm at. Okay, we'll back up one more. We're not quite there yet. Okay. So the Passion of the Christ. This is very well known by us, but there's a lot of things that we're not well known, which is why I'm here tonight to tell you a little bit about this. And in earnest begins after the Last Supper around midnight, Thursday, April 6th, AD 30, in the Garden of Gethsemane at the base of the Mount of Olives, just outside the walls of Jerusalem. You know the rest of the story: betrayal, capture, arrest. Here's something you might not know. It's in Luke 22:14. Luke was a physician, and in his gospel says, quote, Jesus prayed so fervently that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. In the medical literature, this is referred to as hematohydrosis. Next slide. So hematohydrosis, there are 76 documented cases in the medical literature. The idiopathogenesis means why does this happen? It's a physiologic condition that's brought on by profound anger. Fear, profound fear. It's the fight or flight thing. You're just as anxious and scared as you can possibly be. So these small blood vessels that supply the sweat glands in the face, they burst. And then as you sweat, the blood mixes with the sweat and you have bloody sweat. So there is strong physiologic evidence that this really does happen. Really does happen. I read several of the cases, and some of them are truly amazing. Next slide. Okay. So Jerusalem, Friday, April 7th, AD 30, early in the morning. After his arrest, Jesus is taken before the high priest Annas. This is him. He was interrogated and beaten. So this is early morning on a Friday. It's important to remember this timetable now. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, was hastily assembled. Go ahead, next slide. And here's the Sanhedrin. Jesus continues to be mocked and beaten. Jesus is tried for blasphemy. He is without sleep, food, or fluids. He is beaten and bloodied near mental and physical exhaustion. So the passion really hasn't even started yet. He's already in this shape. At this time, as you may recall, Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times. Next slide. So Jesus is dragged from trial to trial. One of these trials was before the high priest, Joseph Caiaphas. This trial basically violates all of the laws. They wanted desperately to kill him. Next slide. So the illegally condemned Jesus is marched to the praetorium courtyard of Pilate. And here's Jesus standing before Pilate, which is thought to be by some to be the actual fortress in the city of Jerusalem, built in the 19th century BC by Herod in Jerusalem. Next slide. And here's that area, and I don't know if I can find it for you on here. Garden of Gethsemane, Golgotha, and there are other. Here's the fortress of Antonia here. So this is approximately where the trial of Jesus takes place, if you can call it that.
So, excuse me.
Sure.
So that area called the Temple, is that presently the Temple Mount in Jerusalem?
That's a great question that I do not know the answer to.
I believe it is.
Okay, if somebody knows the answer to that, please go right ahead. Okay. Can you go back to the previous slide? So it's not quite 7 a.m. on Friday, April 7, AD 30. So Caiaphas demands an immediate audience with Pilate, and he gets it. Caiaphas says to Pilate, he has broken Jewish law and blasphemed. Pilate was not interested. Remember what Tiberius told Pilate. Do not interfere with the Jews. Do not interfere with Jewish law. So Pilate's being told by his boss, don't get involved with this. So Pilate finds no basis to bring charges. He does, however, recognize the Galilean accent of Jesus. So Pilate sends Jesus to Herod Antipas, who is in charge of that jurisdiction. So there's all these jurisdictions. So now they send Jesus to another place. So Jesus is marched to Herod Antipas's place with Caiaphas and then the entire Sanhedrin. And again, they find no basis at all to charge Jesus. And so Jesus goes back to Pilate. Now he's being dragged around in this awful, terrible condition with no sleep, no food, no water, beaten terribly. So after some sly negotiating by Caiaphas, Pilate relents to some extent and sentences Jesus to verbatio, which is Latin for scourging. By the Roman quaternio, I believe it's called, the scourging unit. They have a unit that is particularly set up for this, made of 4 members. Pilate then plans to release him. Pilate's instructions to the quaternio: under no circumstances was Jesus to be killed. But that occasionally happens with scourging. They get a little carried away. So Jesus is scourged severely and is returned to the dungeon. Okay, next slide. One more. Okay, this is the crown of thorns. And I bring this up because it is significant, because this plant was named the crown of thorns. It comes from a particular plant called the Rhamnus nebeca, and it grows wild in the Jerusalem area. The guards weave this into a helmet, more like, rather than a sort of a crown, if you will. And it's placed on his head in a mocking fashion. Next slide. So on this is the Shroud of Turin. You've all heard, I'm sure, of the Shroud of Turin. There are people that spend their entire lives studying the Shroud. If you look carefully here, this is a reverse image, but my pointer works. There's Jesus' face. You can just make that out. Here. His arms crossed. His legs. Very profound. Very profound. So what you see up here, these white areas are consistent with this crown being placed on the head of Jesus, resulting in bleeding. And we'll go on and we'll discuss other things that the shroud supports, the scourging and the things that actually happened to Jesus. So now you know the rest of what happened. There's the release of Barabbas, screaming for the crucifixion by the Jewish mob in the courtyard as Jesus stands next to Pilate. But why does Pilate relent? It was clear to Pilate Pilate by Tiberius, do not, under any circumstances, kill Jesus. Do not get involved in Jewish law. So why do you relent? Why do you call for crucifixion? Caiaphas says to Pilate, you don't want to appear weak to Rome, do you? Jesus, in part, has intimidated. He is a king and a potential threat to Rome. Pilate is concerned about this appearance of weakness and a potential riot by the angry mob. Pilate sentences Jesus to death by crucifixion. So it was Caiaphas, in his unrelenting talk and consistent pushing and suggesting to Pilate to do what he wanted to do, not what Pilate wanted to do. So Pilate passes what's called, and this is some Latin, ius gladii, which is Latin for the right of the sword. So he symbolically washes his hands, which will be the next slide. He symbolically washes his hands in a bowl of water. While drying him, he says, I wash my hands of this man's blood. At this point, Jesus has approximately 6 hours to live. In the profession of faith at every Catholic Mass, there are 3 words acknowledging the Passion: crucifixion and suffered death. Crucifixion and suffered death. In the previous version, some of you may remember, it said he suffered, died, and was buried. Suffered, died, and was buried. And on the third day, the rest of it. So it's a subtle difference, but to me it was a very profound difference, because the suffering is the passion of Christ. The suffering is the passion of Christ. The death, you may argue, well, death for many is a relief. But the passion that he suffered was very profound. So the perception of the Passion now has been sort of cleansed and sterilized. Have any of you seen the Passion of the Christ? Okay. That is not cleansed and sterilized. That is extraordinarily graphic, and based on what I've read and studied, very accurate. Very accurate. Remarkably so. So crucifixion is sort of presented in this Art Deco kind of way. You see various crosses with the depiction of it, and I don't know that one gets this true sense of the impact of the scourging and the actual crucifixion. We'll talk more about that. So one thing, I kept mentioning this, was the physical health of Jesus at this stage. But what kind of a man was he? Physically, what kind of a man? Man was he? Son of God. But he was a man. So it is believed that he was in excellent health. Tall, by many accounts, about 6 feet. And given the work that he did as a carpenter, he was probably physically strong. He had excellent, probably, cardiopulmonary reserve because they walked everywhere, up and down mountains in some extraordinarily difficult areas, as you can imagine, in the desert. In some of the most inhospitable regions in the world. So now I'll present to you some of the best research, with some of the best research available, medical physiology, forensic pathology, that at best explains how Jesus actually died and suffered the passion and then ultimately crucified. So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is the scourging of Jesus, and we'll see that this is why this is important in a moment, and how it's backed up by the Shroud of Turin. So the definition of scourging is it's a verb, meaning to whip, flog, punish, chastise, and inflict severe pain and torment on an individual. The scourging was a preliminary event prior to all Roman executions. The execution squad, or the quaternion, was made up of 4 Roman soldiers, 2 who actually carried out the scourging, called the lictors, the third using an abacus to keep count of the particular number of lashes. And the 4th member of the job was to chain the victim to the scourging pole, as you can see here. And this person was called the exactor mortis. He was also the person to verify the death on the cross. And we will see later what they did to determine that. Next slide. Okay. Actually, I'm sorry, one slide back. I missed something here I want to get. So you can see that these flagellum that they used were made from, were braided thongs of leather, and included in them are these balls of metal in the shape of dumbbells, and this is supported by the Shroud of Turin, which we'll get to in a minute, and sharp teeth bones. So it was meant to do severe harm and to destroy skin, muscle, bone, with every lash. Let me see. Now, this for the scourging, Jesus was stripped of his clothes, his hands tied above his head, as you can see, in an upright position with his back facing the lictors. The back, buttocks, legs were flogged by the 2 lictors. Then Jesus was turned over, and the anterior part of his body was now flogged. So this was a continual thing that went on for a very long time. How long, I do not know. So the intent was to weaken Jesus to a state just short of death. Remember, do not kill him by scourging. Do not kill him by scourging. They wanted to make this even more brutal. Occasionally, the lictors did kill their victims. Remember, in Jesus' case, Pilate gave special instructions that Jesus was not to be killed. So there's some medical aspects of this I'll go into briefly here. It's important to note that the condition of Jesus prior to the scourging. During the 12 hours between 9 p.m. Thursday and 9 a.m. Friday, Jesus had suffered great emotional stress, evidenced by the hematohidrosis. He was abandoned by his disciples. He suffered multiple physical beatings at the first Jewish trial. He had no sleep. He was forced to walk over 2.5 miles between these trials and beaten this entire time. So these physical and emotional events rendered Jesus particularly vulnerable to the adverse hemodynamic, blood pressure and heart rate and all those things, measure your cardiovascular status. He was very susceptible to scourging. So you have to think about this in what was happening. Abandoned by everyone, beaten, no sleep, no fluids, no food, nothing. So these iron balls used by these whips caused deep contusions. The leather thongs with the sharp sheep bones would cut into the skin and subcutaneous tissues. As the scourging continued, the large sheep bones would tear into muscle, lacerating it, producing quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh and skeletal muscle. Quite graphic, but that is what happened. So this pain and blood loss now he's losing blood in addition to not having lost all these fluids, set the stage for what's called hypovolemia, which means decreased fluid in your veins, less blood in your veins, and circulatory shock, which means that your blood pressure continues to drop and drop and drop. Okay, so can we go on to the next slide?
Question.
Yes, sir.
On the diagram, we're at a bad angle. What was the stuff on the right side?
The flogging from the top view. So this is what they would use to flog, and this is the direction of the injuries. And if we go to the next slide, you can see on here, this is the back. So if you look at this, it's very consistent with what they did to all victims, in particular Jesus. These little dumbbell shapes, as you can see, they're all over the place. And so the Shroud of Turin is the back, just shows the back and the head. And there are more than 100 scourge marks, most of them dumbbell shaped. The pattern suggests of a soldier changing positions from one side to the other. And the streamlets of blood down from the crown of thorns is vividly seen. And that's what this is up here. This is his back, his buttocks, and then the head. This is blood. Okay, so next slide. All right, so a little anatomy real quick. So there's a lot of blood. If you've ever cut yourself shaving or nicked yourself or anything, it bleeds like crazy. So the head's got a tremendous amount of vascular supply, so it bleeds quite a bit.
Is it possible during the scourging that you could actually paralyze someone because you're hitting the backbone?
Oh, sure. They frequently die, but most of the reasons they would die from loss of blood. They would basically bleed to death. So vascular supply of the head is very, very profound. So he was bleeding a tremendous amount from these crown of thorns. Go ahead, next slide. And this is the innervation to the head. The point I'm trying to make here is that the scalp was pierced in multiple areas by this crown of thorns that was placed on his head. So they knew what they were doing. These Romans knew what they were doing. They knew about areas that would cause and inflict the most pain. This was not just some random thing that they decided to do this. They knew quite well what was going on. Okay, next slide. This is just another slide looking at the anatomy. Go ahead, next one. Okay. So there's different types of crosses. There's the one we typically know of, the one here. And then there's this type of cross, and I'll get into this. It is quite likely, and more than likely, Jesus was crucified on a cross that looked like this. And I'll explain why in a minute. So we've discussed the origins and uses of crucifixion. Now we'll discuss the crucifixion as it pertains to Jesus. The tau cross, which is shaped like a capital T, this one, was the preferred to the Latin cross, the one we're all familiar with, this one. It's shaped like a lowercase t. The reason the preference for the tau cross was there was an upright pole. That's called the stipes. Right here. Forgive my butchering of Latin. And this stipes was left in the ground. They didn't move this all around, so they left these things in the ground. They would bore out holes in the rock. They would place this in there, and then they would just leave them there. Why that is, you'll see in a moment. So the Crucarius was what the name they used for whoever was being crucified. The condemned man would carry only to petibellum, the petibellum. This is the petibellum. As we all think, we've all seen Stations of the Cross, it shows Jesus carrying the entire cross. And I'll explain to you why that is based on what I have read researched, what everyone has sort of agreed to, that is not what happened. That is not what happened. And I'll explain why in a moment. So the Romans simply placed, next slide. The Romans simply placed the petibellum, which is this piece here, across the shoulders of the person who's being crucified. Now, I'm going to speak in very general sense. I'm not going to say Jesus, so I don't mean to be disrespectful. I'm just, like I said, this is a very scientific approach to what actually happened. So the petibellum was attached by ropes to the arms, put across the nape of the neck. So the Romans simply placed this petibellum into a mortise joint. Those of you that know what mortise joints are, Junior can probably tell us what a mortise joint is. Where's Junior? There he is. So anyway, it was very simple for them. They wanted to be very efficient by this. So they basically they had this stay piece sticking in the ground all over the place. And they just put the petibellum, the part that was already on the back of the crucarius, right on top of this. And there is the crucifixion. There is the cross, which is right here. Now, why do I say it was only the petibellum? It was very unlikely, in fact, almost impossible for Jesus to have carried the entire cross. Here's why. Jesus would have had a 75 to 125 pound petibellum, which is approximately what this weighs, placed across the nape of his neck, and his outstretched arms were tied to this. The weight of the entire tau cross, this cross, would have been close to 300 pounds. Now, a person in excellent shape who was big and strong would have difficulty dragging something like that. Someone in the condition that Jesus was in, given all the things that I've told you, it would be virtually impossible for that to happen. And it's consistent with the way the Romans used crucifixion. Now, this is contrary to what... Yes, sir?
I seem to remember that some of the earliest depictions showed tau cross and not the Latin cross.
Correct.
I mean, artistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It makes sense. Scientifically, it makes sense. Common sense tells you that's quite likely what happened. Okay, let's see where I'm at here. So go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so this is the best slide I could find. Sort of it's called the Via Dolorosa, which is the way of the suffering. So the distance from Pilate's Praetorium to the site of the crucifixion at Golgotha, which means skull place in Aramaic, was about a third of a mile. It's known as the Via Dolorosa, meaning the way of suffering. There were 14 events that occurred here, and we know those to be the 14 stations of the cross. Those only came to be known in about the 18th century. I don't remember who decided that, but it was decided. So in Jesus' weakened condition, coupled with the multiple falls resulting in blunt force trauma to the chest, abdomen, and face, as he was not able to break his fall. So when he would fall onto his face and onto his chest. He was unable to do this like we always do, like we do for falling. A man by the name of Simon Cyrene was compelled by the Romans to help Jesus carry the petibellum. When he reached the site of Golgotha, there were several stipes permanently placed in the ground, like we'd said before. It was approximately 12 noon on Good Friday, April 7th, AD 30. So Jesus at this point had approximately 3 hours to live. Next slide. Thank you. Okay. There's a few graphic slides in here, but I think they're important to make the point. So there's the nailing of Jesus to the cross. So this was the preferred method of Roman practice. The nails, and go ahead to the next slide real quick. Now these are the actual types of nails that they used. The nails were tapered iron spikes about 3/8 of an inch in diameter, about 5 to 7 inches in length. The nails were very expensive, so they were removed after the crucifixion and reused. The nails were driven through the wrists. If you can go back to the last slide for a sec. The nails were driven through the wrist, not the hand. Because if you think about it, there's no way you could support the weight of a person that would just tear right through. So they put it through the wrist, where there's a there is firm tissue there and something called the flexor retinaculum and very lots of tendons and fibrous tissue that would be would be much more efficient in holding the weight of a person. The wrists were considered part of the hands for whatever it's worth, because it says that the nails were placed through the hands. So with that, the anatomy suggests that's consistent. The wrists were part of the hands. So frequently rope would be tied around to prevent this sort of tearing. They wanted the person, the crucarius, to be on the cross and stay there. So the next slide, there's the nails, and then there's one more. This is the calcaneus bone, the heel bone, and here is a nail, and it's bent on the end. This is the only archaeological finding of a nail driven through a calcaneus bone of a crucified man. Now, why is it driven through the side? Sometimes what they did, and it's hard to, I don't think I have a good picture. Can you go to the next one? Maybe I have a picture of it. Yeah. Sometimes what they did, rather than nailing the feet on top of one another like this, which I will show you in a minute is unlikely that it happened that way, they would put the legs on either side and then drive a nail through the calcaneus bone into the wood, and then they would stabilize the lower part of the body, lower extremities that way, which is consistent with what, can you go back to the other one? Which is consistent with what they actually found. So this is just more evidence supporting what was actually found in Jerusalem in those areas. Okay, so here's the nailing of the hand. So this is basically the flexor retinaculum, and there's a median nerve, so they knew exactly what to do and where to put this to cause the most pain. That median nerve, a nail driven through that causes an excruciating pain. And it's called causalgia. And that in and of itself, that pain in and of itself has been known to cause death because of this intense, unremitting pain. Okay, next one. And there's some more anatomy. Median nerve, it's right here. So you can see it's right in the middle of the wrist where they would drive a nail. Okay, next one. So here is what we typically see, that the two bones, the bones were put on top of one, the 2 feet were put on top of the other, and then a nail driven right through the metatarsal bones, which are just the equivalent of these bones in your hand on your feet, the longer bones between your toes and your ankle, as you can see on here. So next, go ahead to the next one. I've got a few slides in here. This just simply shows the anatomy. Again, more nerves here that were injured by driving these large nails through. One more, please. More of the same. Go ahead. And more of the same. Sometimes I give this talk to people that are physicians or other people that are interested in this kind of thing. So, okay, so now the titulus, which is what they put at the top. Jesus, King of the Jews. Now, they wrote it in 3 languages. Let me see if I can get this right here. So it was actually written by Pilate. It was written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, so all could read it. The titulus was attached to the top of the stapes, and the length, now here's something very interesting. The length of survival on the cross ranged from a few hours, 3 to 4 hours, to 3 or 4 days. The length of survival was inversely proportional to the severity of the scourging. In other words, if you were scourged severely, and you had been bleeding, and you'd be on the cross for probably a short period of time before you died. Whereas if the scourging wasn't quite as severe, you'd be in better physical shape and last longer on the cross. Pick your poison. I don't know. One more, Peter?
John,
Yes?
how did they raise them up?
Good question. I didn't cover that, and I apologize for that. They used ladders, and they basically hoisted, and they lifted the pedibellum with the crucarius on there. Thank you, Pierre. And they plopped it right down into this mortise joint, and it was very stable. And that's how they stayed on the cross. Okay, so one more. So Jesus spoke 7 times while on the cross. He said, "Father, forgive me, for they know not what they do." And speaking to the repentant criminal on his left side, Jesus said, "Thou shalt be with me in paradise." The other did not believe. He says, so why don't you save yourself? As you probably can remember, he said, behold thy mother. Son, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means why, which is Aramaic for my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he said, I thirst. And then at the time he knew he was going to die, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And then he said, it is finished. So at approximately 3 p.m. on Friday, April 7th, AD 30, Jesus died a physical death. They estimate that he was between 33 and 36 years old. No way to know for sure, but based upon all the dating, that is the approximate dating. Okay, so next slide. There we go. So basically what you need to know here is that when you breathe in, it's an active process. Take a deep breath, you have to work at it. But when you exhale, it's very passive. Air just comes out because the chest recoils and the lungs, and that's when you speak, when you're exhaling. Although some people can't speak when they inhale, but most of us speak when we're exhaling. The reason I mention this is you'll see that this is very critical when you're on the cross. So inspiration is an active process. The diaphragm pulls the lungs down, and then the chest expands, and then it recoils, and then you exhale. So that's really what I want you to understand here. Can you go to the next slide? And this is just more anatomy to suggest the same thing with the rib cage. The inhalation is active, the muscles contract, exhalation is passive, and the muscles relax. Okay, next slide. This is very busy, and I don't think you'll understand all this, so we'll just go on to the next one. More business that I don't need to get into at this point, and more. And very detailed, messy slide. Lisa said this is too messy, and it probably is. But here, this is what I'm getting at. Breathing on the cross. So how in the world could you possibly breathe when you're on the cross like this? Now, they in this particular picture, they don't show that the rope. Now, the question is, did they take it off? Did they not take it off? But they more than likely they were able to. They did take this off from what I've read and what I've seen, because the hands, the arms were secure, and this bottom piece, which I can't remember the name of, but somebody asked me about that little piece of wood on here. What's that? I think so, yes, thank you. Was useful because that's how you push up to exhale. So this is it was a very, very difficult process to inhale and exhale. So what happens is after a while, you become fatigued, you're breathing less, you get less oxygen in, carbon dioxide builds up in your system, and there's all kinds of consequences to that. Let's see, can you go on to the next? Let's see, that's 57, that's good, breathing on the cross. Okay, so then they have actually done studies with volunteers that are tied to a cross, they're not nailed, and then they monitor all their blood pressure, their heart rate, their breathing, and all these kinds of things to study what actually happens when you're on the cross, and on a cross like that, and how you're desperately trying to breathe. So for the most part, there's something that occurs as a result of this called asphyxiation, which you may have heard that, where basically you're just not getting enough oxygen. And it gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. And then what continues there is that if any of you have been walked up a flight of stairs and your legs kind of hurt and they burn, their calves, they kind of burn, well, that means that you're building up acid in those legs. And it means you switch to a different type. You're running out of oxygen, so you're going into what's called oxygen debt, and you build up acid because our type of respiration changes. The point is that when you have lots of oxygen, everything's fine, but when you don't have lots of oxygen, you develop this acid, lactic acid in your legs, and then it takes a little while for it to go away, but it does, as the blood perfuses the legs and the oxygen gets there, and then it goes away. So this is all this slide is saying, talking about cellular respiration. On to the next one. More of the same, and way more detail than we need to go into, and even more that we don't need to go into. So here, If a coroner was going to write the certificate of death, what would he have said? So the actual pathologic and forensic cause of the death of Jesus Christ is essentially the following. There is one particular person that I've read, Dr. Frederick Zugibe. He's the chief medical examiner at the University of Rochester in Rockland County. In Rockland County, New York. I don't know where exactly where that is. But he would have written that the cause of death was cardiac and respiratory arrest due to hypovolemic and traumatic shock due to crucifixion. So essentially what that is that during the scourging and all the events that went on before that, no food, no water, bleeding, the trauma, no sleep, all of that, then the scourging, loss of more blood, the multiple times falling, being hung on the cross, not being able to breathe, resulted in what's called hypoxemic death. You basically die from asphyxiation, not being able to breathe. That contributed also to the very, very, very low blood pressure from all of the blood loss. So it's actually, but it was probably multifactorial. Everybody dies from essentially cardiorespiratory arrest unless it's a trauma. Their heart and lungs stop working for all different reasons. So other contributors may have been things like hypovolemic shock, asphyxia, things of that sort. But we've discussed some of those. But other things could have been his heart started to beat, fibrillate. He might have had fluid collecting in the lungs and around the heart, or the heart may have ruptured. There's all kinds of things that may have happened. But here's a couple of other things I found very interesting. The medical record and forensic evidence suggests that Jesus was already dead before the piercing of his side. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumptions that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with what the pathology suggests. Now, his legs were not broken. And why do I say that? Because the legs of the other two were broken. And the reason they did that was to speed along death, because you needed to be able to push up on your legs to be able to breathe. If you were unable to do that, you would die from asphyxia very quickly. And the reasons for that are they were speeding along death so that it would happen before the beginning of the Sabbath and Passover. So the next day was the Sabbath, on Saturday, for the Jewish people there. And the other, this thing, breaking of the legs, is called crucifaxion. Crucifaxion, which basically they broke the leg, the bones between the knee and the ankle. Both the tibia and fibula were smashed with a sledgehammer type device. So then they had to be buried within about 24 hours of their death. They could not be left on the cross. Feast days, things of that sort. There were rules. Yes.
Why would they be concerned about the Sabbath? Weren't they the Romans that did the
Yep.
crucifixion?
They did. They were the Romans, right?
They care less.
Yes, but remember, the people that asked for the death,
Doesn't mean the other two.
right? But the people calling for the death of Jesus in this particular case were the Jews.
Right. Okay, I can see about Jesus,
Yeah.
but I'm talking about the other two.
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I would imagine it has something to do with Jewish law and people being, because this was in Jerusalem, where they were.
Plus, they had to ask permission to actually take him down.
That is true.
So they could care less as to when he died.
You would certainly think so. You would certainly think so. But I don't. So I really don't know the answer to that question. Next slide.
Could just be practical. It's just interesting.
Oh yeah, I don't know.
We're in Israel, right?
Uh-huh.
Things shut down. If I'm a Roman soldier and I want to eat, I want to leave because I'm not going to be able to get anything. It might be just practical in terms of the Roman soldier saying, "I want to get out of here."
I hadn't thought about that. Maybe. Anyway, so here's another thing that we've all heard about in the gospel, and it's the piercing of the side of Jesus. The reason this is important because the forensic evidence, the anatomy, the physiology, all of that supports exactly what it says in the Bible. So it's well documented, and John, I have to read this because I can't remember all of it. It's well documented in John 19:32-34 that the exactor mortis pierced the right side of Jesus and, quote, straight away there came blood and water. The piercing of the right side of Jesus through the intercostal muscles, which is the muscles between the ribs. This is consistent with findings on the Shroud of Turin. The Greek word John used in the Gospel, written in Greek, was pleura. And we still use that word today to describe the lining of the lungs and then the lining of the chest cavity where the two move when you breathe. The pleural space, it's a potential space, but it can fill with fluid as a result of all of this trauma. The heart, around the sac around the heart can fill with fluid. So more than likely he had what's called a pleural effusion, which is a lot of fluid collecting in the chest. And the reason that's important, I'll tell you in a moment. So given the upward angle of the sword, it's quite likely they entered the chest first. So if you can imagine being on the cross and then you're piercing somebody's side, you're likely going to do it from the front and the side, so you're going to be pushing upward. So based upon all that, they've ruled out the abdominal cavity as a source of the blood and fluid. And it's very consistent with what happened. And it follows as the following. The following describes that in a very clinical way. It says the pleural effusion, this fluid collecting inside the lung area, was the source of the water. There's lots of different reasons why this happens. I won't go into detail, but just suffice it to say that fluid can collect out between the lungs and in that space. There, it's called the pleural effusion, the source of the water. The source of the blood, with evidence available, supports the piercing of the right side of the chest and the spear piercing the right atrium. There's 4 chambers of the heart. There's the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle. So go ahead to the next one. Maybe I'll show So there's some of the anatomy of the heart. So the actual events are as follows. The exactor mortis, and this is the person who was responsible for figuring out if the crucified person has died. Spear entered the right chest at an upward and posterior angle, which means upward, and then posterior means backward. This formed a path for this pleural fluid to come out, which was under pressure, quite likely, and the tip of the spear pierces the right atrium. And if I could find my pointer, I'll show you that. And it's right over here. Does that say right atrium? Can you read that from there? Yeah. Right atrium. Okay, so it probably came up through here, pierced through into the lung area, and then right into the right atrium. Now we know from the Gospel that it says blood and water came out. That's why. That is most likely why. It's a perfectly reasonable explanation of the pathology that went on to cause this, and the Bible describes it very accurately. Okay. So I think, can you go to the next slide? It's just more of the same, more anatomy. So to summarize what I've spoken about today is the second most significant event in the world has ever known, the passion of Jesus. The most significant, of course, being the resurrection, the basis of our faith. The passion is one of the most controversial topics in the world. And I've given you the current best theories regarding the pathophysiology, the forensic pathology, using the most recent information to date. But there is still a very bitter controversy that rages and will probably go on for a very, very long time, trying to decide what's happening. So, in my opinion, what I've just presented to you is based on purely medical science. That science supports what is in the gospel, I think, very, very clearly and very powerfully, I believe. So I believe that science, which is the way I was trained to think, can coexist with our Catholic faith. And I think this suggests that. I do not think the two are mutually exclusive. Okay? That's about all I have to say tonight. Yes?
What you described is completely compatible with shown on the Shroud of Turin.
It is. The marks on the back, on the chest and the legs, the crown of thorns, all show that blood and these contusions and these lacerations were in the places that you typically expect them to be on someone that was scourged like Jesus was. It's very consistent. You know what? Didn't I say that? You caught me. You're very good at this. You caught me on that one. And I don't think I have a slide of the actual piercing that supports that evidence. I wasn't able to find one. But certainly all the others support that. Certainly all the other evidence on the shroud supports what actually happened. Yes, sir.
I have a few questions. So going back to the one I asked earlier. So how did somebody help them, Jesus, carry the cross? Because obviously, for my whole life, I thought somebody handed the cross to the person. So did he walk with Jesus, or do we have any idea?
I couldn't tell you. But just based upon laws of physics, it seems like somebody carrying something that's 300 pounds over several miles, or I don't know the exact distance, in the weakened state that Jesus was in, it would be virtually impossible. So Simon somehow was able to assist him along the way. Yeah.
And two other questions that I have. One, if he had the traditional cross that you had mentioned, the large T, how did we get to this cross? And then where did they mount? Because I know there was some graphics there. Where did they mount that titulus to the cross then?
I don't know why this is the cross that we. I don't know the story of that, and that's something I do need to look into. But for some reason, this is the Latin cross is the one that we all see and we're all familiar with. And the Tau cross, based on all the evidence, the mechanism of crucifixion by the Romans suggests that they used the Tau cross and not the Latin cross. And where they put the titulus, don't know for sure, but probably somewhere on top of the crossbeam.
Do you think the temperature at the time was a lot cooler that maybe promoted Jesus' ability to...
That's a good question. I don't know. It would have been spring. So I don't know the temperature, what the temperature would be in that area around spring. I would imagine it would be similar to here.
The weather's very similar to here.
Yeah, similar to here.
But remember when we went to Israel, they told us it was cooler in his time.
Oh, okay.
And that's true. I mean, we always assume that things have the weather that they have now, and they don't necessarily. I'm not sure that what we see now is quite what they have.
Well, certainly there were areas of desert around there, and then during the summertime, I would imagine it would be warm. But this would have been early spring or mid-spring. Does anybody have any other questions, comments, suggestions?
So just going back to another thing too. So the step, do we know that if he had that little step there?
Usually they did that to support the weight of the person being crucified.
But then would they then separate the legs and smash the rod?
That one picture of the calcaneus with the nail through it suggests that that's what's done. Right. The reason I pointed to this cross is because it's unlikely they drove one nail through. I mean, if you try to put your feet on top of one another, it's kind of hard to do. So more than likely they had, and I actually saw a cross in a place in Santa Barbara in a church that showed both feet next to each other nailed this way. Has anybody ever seen a cross like that? So it's that is what would make much more sense to me than doing it this way, based on what I've read. Go ahead.
Yeah, I heard that the real cruelty of the crucifixion was that the man was he had only two positions he could be in: slumped down on that little seat, but then he couldn't breathe.
That's right.
And then just to breathe, he had to put weight on this.
Exactly.
Terribly painful wound in his feet to lift himself.
And his back, and all of these other things. So it was an alternating, one thing I didn't mention, it was alternating sort of Y and T position. So he'd have to pull himself up to breathe and then back down. And you can imagine how difficult that must have been. Please. Yes.
I have a question. Product Turin, have they confirmed that that is indeed the linen that they
Well, they've done carbon dating on that, and from what I'm certainly not an expert in that, and people have written tons of books on it, but my understanding is that the carbon dating they did was from an area of the shroud that had been replaced because the shroud had burned, a particular area of it had burned. And when they did the carbon dating, that's what it came up to be, only dated back to the 12th or 13th century. The problem is nobody will where the shroud is right now, I cannot remember. I don't think it's in Turin. Is it still in Turin? Okay. They won't let them touch it. The last time they were able to get at it, the scientists, which scientists would love to get at it, was 1978. Was the last carbon dating.
So I attended a talk by a priest who actually does research in shroud of Turin.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because one of the things that he said that struck me was that the image that's on the shroud is really clear. And he was saying that the interesting thing is that, rigor mortis only lasts for a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that the image is so clear shows that the body was only wrapped around it, the way that it was wrapped is of a body rigor mortis.
Mm-hmm.
And so after 36 hours or something like that, the body starts to not be rigor mortis.
Right.
But the image that was captured is of the body rigor mortis because, as we know, 36 hours later, what happens? It's Easter Sunday. So I thought that was really fascinating. It didn't, because if it was there longer and if it was of a body that did not leave the linen, then it would have been a different image.
Yeah.
So they were talking about how these angles were, he was doing the 3D side display of how the body.
Yeah, it is. It is remarkable. They've looked at they've looked at various types of pollen and fibers and things of that sort that were in the area that were detectable on the shroud, and I couldn't even begin to explain it all, but there are many, many books, papers, and things of that sort written on that. I brought a couple of books if anybody is interested to look at this in depth on their own, if I can find them here. One is called The Doctor at Calvary. And I'll leave them up here if you want to come look. And then this one is The Crucifixion and Death of a Man Called Jesus from the Eyes of a Physician. And here's another one, A Physician's View. He died for us. And then this one, in my opinion, is the most scientific of this, if you will. The Crucifixion of Jesus, a forensic inquiry by this gentleman, Frederick T. Zugabi, MD, PhD. And he's a coroner. He's a coroner.
If you want, I can set them.
Yeah, sure. If they want to look at them, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, anybody have any other questions or anything? Yeah.
From a medical standpoint, just curious, at what point was the body too far gone to basically do anything about it? At what point did he cross his body cross the point of no return?
Well, he was still alive on the cross for a period of time. But from what I've read and from what my understanding is, and just my own understanding of pathophysiology, at the point he was unable to breathe, that Jesus was unable to sustain respiration, that would have been sort of finishing, when he said, it's finished. And I tell you what, I've seen, unfortunately, in my lifetime, more people die than I care to remember. And I firmly believe that people know when some people just decide it's time, and they sort of say, okay, and then they're at peace with that, and then they die. So there is a will to live, and I believe that there is maybe a will to die. Just my opinion.
That slide with the shroud picture, did that indicate that he had a mustache? Was it, or was that just the
I don't know. I didn't actually pay a lot of attention to that. Maybe it's possible. Frequently beard. I mean, I've seen all kinds of depictions of Jesus over the years, but beards and mustaches were quite common.
I just didn't really see. See? You see? Thanks.
Yeah, I see what you're looking at, right?
But it could just be the way.
Right here.
Yes.
You sort of suggest maybe a beard and a mustache? Not sure. Not sure. I don't know. I've actually never looked, to be honest with you. But you know, all of the depictions of Christ on the cross, they're all different. Throughout time, tradition, research that's been done. So this is just a snippet of what I was able to pull together from the research that I was able to do in the books I've read.
I apologize for being late, but how did you come up with April 7th?
It was from the literature that I read in several different cases, they pinpointed the date as April 7th. How they were able to do that, I'm not sure, but I've read. Don't know. Because it's interesting. Easter falls on different. It's early and then it's really late. I think this year isn't it early this year for some reason? Early this year, right?
I read somewhere that the guys rose after they died, they put coins on top of the idols to keep them close.
Oh, I don't know.
And they said that the coins that they had put there had the thing of Julius Caesar.
Oh, could be, because that was render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. I think it's in the gospel somewhere. Jesus actually said that, of many things he said. Anything else?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome very much. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for a special presentation on the physical death of Jesus Christ, presented by medical professional Joseph Rosa.